Hey, welcome back to a new video. I'm Molly and this is Shutter Studios. Today you're going to learn how to shoot in manual on your DSLR. We're going to look into ISO, shutter speed and aperture, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll understand a little bit more about them. Before we even look at how you actually shoot in manual and understanding ISO, shutter speed and aperture, first we're going to take it back to basics, how to hold your camera. But quite often or not, sometimes you don't hold the camera quite steady enough and it then ruins your pictures. So hopefully a few of these tips will make it easier for you when you next go out on a shoot. So, how to hold a camera, and also I don't recommend throwing your camera about like that either. Probably most obvious things, put it over your head. It basically means if you end up dropping your camera, it's going to stay round your neck. And it doesn't mean expensive equipment falling on the floor and getting broken. So you firstly want to take your right hand and put it on the right side of the camera. This means you have access to the shutter button as well as all other functions quite quickly as you're taking a photo. With your left hand you want to place this under the lens. This is going to support the weight of the camera. It also means you can move and change your focal length. Now this is pretty much the basic way of holding the camera, and over time you'll develop your own natural way of holding it. You also want to make sure that you hold the camera close to your body. By holding it close, it becomes more stable. Adopting a wider stance against a wall, or even crouching. These are ways you can maintain balance and become steadier when taking your photos. Another option is to use a tripod. You may also want to do this with a remote shutter. Using a remote shutter or a timer will reduce any shake you do as soon as you press that shutter button. So firstly, what actually is exposure? Exposure is the amount of light that's let into your camera sensor or film. Exposure is balanced by three things: ISO, shutter speed and aperture. In order to get a correctly exposed photo, you want your light meter to be in the center or at the zero. If you don't have this, this can result in an overexposed or an underexposed photo. Now sometimes this might be the case, this might be what you want for the effect you're doing, but the majority of the time you'll want a correctly exposed photo, and today we're going to look at how you do that. Firstly, we'll look at ISO. ISO is International Standards Organization. ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. Simply, the lower the ISO number is, the less sensitive it is to light. The higher the ISO number is, the more sensitive it is to light. Sadly, the higher the ISO, the lower the quality the image will be. This is purely due to noise. But as technology advances, you're able to push the ISO a lot more nowadays than probably what you're used to, and the image will still come out pretty alright. 100 and 200 ISO are normally the most ideal, but when you shoot in a lower light situation, chances are you might have to bump up your ISO. Now that we've looked at ISO, let's take a look at shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open for when you take a photo. The longer the shutter is open for, the more light is let into the camera. So the less time it's open for, the less light is taken in. When you shoot with a longer shutter speed, chances are you're going to need a tripod, much like what my camera's on right now. As a rule of thumb, I always make sure that I'm on at least 1/60th of a second when shooting handheld. Another way I look at it, and one way I've found out over the time of using a camera, is make sure your shutter speed is longer than the focal length you're using. I find when I use the standard 18 to 55mm lens that comes with the camera, sticking to 1/60th a second is pretty alright, and I can even bump it up to about 180, maybe 1/200th of a second if I'm in really good lighting. But when I end up using a lens like this that goes 70 to 300, I found I definitely need to bump up my shutter speed. I found this personally throughout my time of using a camera. If I've gone to use this lens and I've ended up using a shutter below 1/70th of a second, chances are my photos are going to come out blurry because, you know, we're not all got the super steady hand that we think we do. Normally what I do is whatever focal length I'm on, I make sure I'm doing more than that. But that's pretty much it on shutter speed. It's pretty simple really, it's just how long the shutter stays open for when you take a photo. Last and not least, aperture. Aperture is how much light is let into the camera. This can be described as the f number or the f-stop. It's basically a simple way of describing the size of the aperture. Unlike ISO and shutter speed, aperture can get a little bit confusing. So the larger the aperture, the smaller the number. The smaller the aperture, the bigger the number. Aperture becomes a really key part in depth of field. So the wider or larger the aperture is, the smaller the f-stop, which means the shallower the depth of field. So then, the narrower or smaller the aperture is, the bigger the f-stop number is, which means the deeper the depth of field will become. A very simple way of putting it is a deep depth of field has the majority of the subject matter in focus, or landscape, or whatever you're shooting. A shallow depth of field might only have one object or subject matter in focus. Okay, so that is pretty much what ISO, shutter speed and aperture are. You need all three of these to correctly expose a photo. So now I'll show you how I change my ISO, shutter speed and aperture on a Canon EOS 100D. The ways in which you change all three of these things may differ between the style, the model, the make or the brand of your camera. Changing ISO, shutter and aperture. First, turn on your camera. Make sure your dial is set to M. M basically means manual. On my camera there's a little button and underneath it says ISO. When I click this button it gives me a load of options from auto to 12,800. For me I got a little shutter wheel up at the top of the camera. If I turn it to the left I'll get a slower shutter. If I turn it to the right I'll get a quicker shutter. To work the aperture is pretty much the same as shutter, except I need to press the AV button on the back. I'll do this with my thumb. You hold down the AV button and slide the shutter wheel. All these functions are placed so that it makes it easy when you come to shoot. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching and sticking around to the end of the video. I hope you now have a bit of a better understanding of how to shoot in manual on your DSLR. If you do have any questions or have missed anything, please comment that down below and I'll make sure to respond to you. If there is any other how-to videos or any other videos you want me to do, please comment that down below. I also want to let you all know that we have a store, shutterstudios.co.uk/store if you want to go ahead and check it out. The link will be in the description below. If you found this video useful, please remember to hit that like button. If you could also show your support by hitting that red subscribe button and following us on social media, it would mean so much. So that is it for today's video. I hope to see you all again in my next video or over on my social media. Stay safe and I'll see you later. Bye.